Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this talk on Operation Analytics, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you for joining us, firstly, from your remote locations around the UK. I myself and here in Essex, trying to make the most of this wonderful office room I'm in. But what we're going to do for you today is spend about 40 minutes going through this topic to try and give you a whistle-stop tour through some of the learning we've had within DMW and around running operational analytics. Hopefully it'll balance out on a number of different levels. So we've got a little bit of detail in here that we'll touch on, but primarily what you want you to come away with from this talk is some key messages about how you can do this well, how you can get your setup right, and how and some forward thinking for your organization. Okay. So just a bit of context, DMW Group, we're a advisory, delivery and engineering firm. We specialise in cloud, data and digital, work with these partners I've got on screen, mix of obviously sort of cloud partners as well as consultancy and as well as vendor software. Okay, but what we typically do is we focus on accelerating modern change for organisations. A little bit of context on me. So I'm managing consultant with the firm, specialist in data and advanced analytics. On the call, we've also got my colleagues, James Watson and Tom Smith. They are also from our data practice. Tom will be answering questions at the end with me. A little bit of housekeeping. It says it on the screen. Please post questions in the Q&A feed. James will be on hand throughout to answer any immediate questions ahead of that. Obviously, there's network issues. The signal in Essex can be a little bit dodgy at times, but hopefully we'll ride that through and be absolutely fine. And please do provide feedback. You've got potential to win £100 of Amazon vouchers. Okay, so Operation Analytics. We get asked a number of questions in the firm when we engage on analytics and operational delivery, but one of the things that really crops up sits around sort of these three question areas that I've got on screen now. And actually right now, COVID response is a really good example of this, where at clients we're seeing examples where we have analyses and content or analytics products, you might call them, that people have developed that are now suddenly operationally critical. Okay, and my current client is a really good example of that, where reports that were built for insight have now turned into absolutely critical assets that are being used to drive very important business outcomes. You know, analytics is about us being responsive in organizations, and therefore this happens quite a lot. But extreme scenarios such as the ones we're in tend to make this manifest more, and this is a risk to organizations. The other points I suppose on the left is that as we see data science bedding in as a capability across a lot of our client firms, you know, it's moving from something that is more a fad, or fad's probably the wrong word, more a phase of people engaging with advanced analytics more formatively. People are now looking at how you operationalize it, and they're realizing this is quite hard. And I suppose one of the key things we want to do today is talk through, or how can we make this a bit easier. But if you're going to come away with one message from today, it's that if you haven't already, start to invest in DataOps as a capability. The reason I say this, and we're going to spend the first half of the talk around DataOps and what we need to do to make it successful, the second half on how you, some sort of ideas for how you actually really ensure that DataOps embeds properly in your organization. But the reason that's such a focus is because we've seen it as being so critical to organizations setting up robust constructs, so whether that be services or technology or process, in order to be able to serve operational analytics. And its emergence as a concept is really important to us as an organisation. That's why we're having this talk now. So one message, if there's anything, is start to invest in DataOps as a capability. I suppose sat behind that, a bit of context of what we do in data in DMW. What I tend to work on quite heavily is this offering on the right here, so analytics engineering commoditization. So what we help clients do quite often is them deliver scalable data analytics using DataOps, integration of advanced analytics, and very closely linked to that, the enablement of scalable, reliable, and secure data analytics on cloud. Okay, so that's what we would like to focus on as part of sort of advisory engineering, and therefore that's really the basis for why we're talking to you today. So one other little bit of context before I get into the data ops piece, and that's a little bit of background on me, just again to sort of build on that piece there. So um, what's most interesting about data ops and operational analytics is the change that's taken place over the last 10 years. And I myself are probably a good example of someone who's undergone quite a significant change in terms of my professional focus areas. And that's part of the main reason I'm actually speaking to you today. About 10 years ago, I started work as actually a statistician, if anything else, and I focused a lot on these products we got at the right, R, SAS for my sins, which is sort of clinical sciences, and then moved into IBM for a number of years, working with products like SPSS Modeler and actually R as they started to integrate. And what was most interesting at that time, particularly with products like R and R Studio, was that period, just at the start of the data science fad, as I call it, was around when people started to realize that actually operational analytics and the need to productionize more advanced analytics as well as sort of data pipeline management scale was becoming something more and more important. So my initial frame for a lot of the questions I was dealing with professionally were on the top left, things like what confidence do I have in this projection, or how do I fit this model? A lot of sort of classical inference methods. But then I started to move into things like, well, how do I manage peripheral conditions? Because I was starting to deal with operational scenarios, particularly in that SPSS modeler phase, where actually it was the model wasn't so important. It was also how do we handle some of the real life scenarios in terms of peripheral conditions to make sure there was trust in that model output. And this was again sort of 6 to 8 years ago or so. And that operational aspect started to manifest itself in my work. You'll notice I put Puppet here up as a product. Things like configuration management, the management of the estate we were running with, which wasn't a cloud estate, but it was essentially an on-premise cloud, was also starting to come into play in terms of managing the server and deployment relationships for those models that I was dealing with. Scoot on sort of 2 to 3 years, that expanded basically, and a lot of my recent work in both IBM and also my in DMW, which I moved to afterwards, started to focus on this operational shift. So starting to answer questions like how do I reduce contention, how do I ensure self-serve deployments are reliably curated, and starting to work with a much broader product set, and obviously what many of you on this call I'm sure will be familiar with is around the large ecosystem or large set of analytics products that are starting to sort of manifest out in the marketplace these days. One particular big piece of work was around sort of commoditizing data through the cloud era on AWS cloud, but also sort of quite a level of deep familiarization with Apache Spark. And what I was doing was focusing on managing engineering teams who were dealing with the orchestration of these capabilities. So building on sort of Puppet as an automation software, but then moving to more push-based paradigms like Ansible, working with Azkaban for scheduling, Jenkins, a lot of us know, but that was sort of a starting point for deployment services. And also about working with products like Splunk for sort of at-scale logging and alerting management. More recently, Anaconda, DataIQ implementations, and then most recently, working with a number of more progressive product sets across the cloud vendors. So Redshift, Kubernetes, Databricks, and just generally Azure, and actually spending a lot of time recently working with Palantir's Foundry offering, which is quite interesting for those of you who've sort of been exposed to it. But Foundry is essentially a Spark on Kubernetes backend, massive ecosystem of data applications. But the one most interesting thing about Palantir do with their data is they treat data as code. Okay, and so sort of that changing context from analytics to operation analytics is what drove a lot of my work over the last few years. And I suppose what I'm talking to you today is some lessons learned about them. Key thing is, if these are the sort of questions that you're asking in your job, I'm a strong believer that DataOps and a lot of the more modern disciplines that are coming off the back of this are designed to address that. So let's start with the good. Okay, let's start with the good. So the good thing is DataOps, as I mentioned, and the good thing is it's maturing. Okay, so we're now at a stage where out in the industry there is enough guidance out there to be able to rely on best practice for developing a DataOps capability. And I'm going to talk to you a bit for the next 5-10 minutes on what that looks like. Okay, and the key thing is it's maturing. And Well, let's just start off for those of you who aren't familiar with a high-level view of what DataOps is. So it is, well, it's defined in a couple of different ways. On the left, Gartner defines it as a management practice that focuses on improving communication, integration, and automation of data flows. And the key thing there, I suppose, it's between the data managers and the data consumers. So it's about ensuring that your data consumers are correctly served with data. And when I say data, to me, that is not just sort of bog standard data pipelines, your classic sort of ETL or data mart processes. That is about insight as well. It's about output of analytical models. On the right, the data science view I quite like, because actually that they sort of highlight it as this two tribes piece. And the reason DataOps has cropped up as a discipline is because it's about dealing with that classical, I suppose, lack of reconciliation between two pretty distinct disciplines. That is one of delivering analytics and insight, and that is of delivering IT services. And what people have realized with this is that unless you provide a capability that can straddle the two and can effectively link data consumer needs to the I suppose the service and IT requirements that are needed to fill them, you can't effectively support a modern data analytics discipline. And that's where DataOps comes in. And so the idea is that you're building a capability that builds on a lot of DevOps and modern delivery principles, but one that's oriented around sort of serving those data consumer needs specifically. And I'll get into this in a second. I suppose the other key thing about DataOps is 2 years ago it really started on the Gartner hype cycle. So this is a frame from 2018, and you can see it sort of down here on the left. We're approaching that point where DataOps is getting ready to enjoy the downhill ride. So we need to be talking about it, because a lot of businesses are trying this out. And as with any hype cycle, we see sort of blockchain ahead of us and Spark itself, we're getting to the sort of trough of the danger of the trough of disillusionment stage. And so what I want to do today is just talk about how we avoid that. The other thing that we're in a good place for, and the reason I'm saying it's maturing, is because we now have a manifesto and books. And if you haven't seen these, please do go take a look. You'll be able to get a copy of this afterwards. But there are publications O'Reilly really rate as a publisher in the data engineering and advanced analytics space. They've put this book out, getting DataOps right. We also have companies like Data Kitchen, who are pushing DataOps offerings, but also distributed tools like the DataOps cookbook, and behind they sit behind the DataOps Manifesto, which is now opted in openly. We have also DataOps communities, and Medium also has a very distinct area now for collating DataOps information that's emerging from businesses. And I suppose this book on the right is quite an interesting one. It's freely available if you Google it. But what we're also starting to get out is that insight, much lower level insight about approaches for IT infrastructure and cloud management to really make sure that your DataOps capability is technically effective. Okay, I'm not going to go through that in too much detail on this call because it's written down already, and actually I can reference it here. What I'm going to try and do is cover some higher level points around guiding you in the right way. So what is DataOps? Well, I've given you a definition, but let's talk a bit about that more meaningfully. So the tenets that are set out in those books that I've just shown you talk about three things. They talk about, for DataOps, think services, infrastructure as code, and automate everything. And this may seem familiar to some of you. I'll come on to that in a second. But the important point here is that we're taking a service-oriented view to developing data capabilities that provide our data consumers effectively the data and insight they need in an automated fashion. Okay. And the tenets, I suppose, are channeling these because in order to do that, what we're adopting are these DevOps principles of infrastructure as code and automating everything where possible. Okay, so it's about marrying those two disciplines between DevOps and analytics. To build on that, I suppose the key things behind this are, when you talk about think services, it's about applying agile process to developing a data capability. It's about having those customer feedback loops. With infrastructure as code, it's about applying software engineering best practice and maintenance of multiple environments. And with automation, it's about toolchain integration. And testing everything. And toolchain integration is a good example of where DataOps, by extension, is not just a single app that someone may be developing on. So that when we focus on, let's say, DevOps techniques, we may be developing a single application, or we may be developing a platform stack. With DataOps, we're much more thinking about the end-to-end data pipeline as concept and how do we orchestrate and manage that. So there are some subtleties that already come out in terms of differences there. One way I've seen it described recently, and this is the sort of last I'll sort of say on this DataOps description, is that it's a practice for automating the provision of storage systems that makes data readily accessible to applications. I saw this in quite a recent article released last week. I actually think this is wrong. I think the best description is this on the right. So to me, what this consolidates as is a practice for automating the provision of services that make data readily available to consumers. So it's not an IT-centric offering necessarily. When you're building a DataOps team, you're not just talking about plugging data into other applications. What you're thinking about is how do I create a data pipeline and automated data services management capability that provides data not just to other applications operationally, but also can provide it to direct consumers through a platform you may have procured, whether it be Cloudera, whether it be Foundry, whether it be AWS native services. But the point is, it's that automation of services. So that's all well and good, fine. Problem here though is, how is it different from DevOps? You know, you're probably sitting here watching this and thinking, well, Mark, this is the same as DevOps. Really, no distinction here. You know, we can do this already. Well, in the manifesto, it talks about a couple of things. It talks about the fact this isn't just DevOps. It's about agile process as well. It's about lean process, so lean manufacturing, Six Sigma. It's about bringing together those ideals in terms of the way you optimize and manage your deployment of data pipelines. But there's a couple of other distinctions I'm going to draw as well. That's what I'm going to talk through. So the first thing for me is that point on the right, maintain multiple environments. A key difference for DataOps versus DevOps to me is about differentiating your data software development lifecycle from your application or platform software development lifecycle. And that's a really important distinction. You know, typically IT services confuse the two, but actually what people tend to work in now is production-like domains for the way they manage their data. So you might have a dev test prod stack for your applications, for your platforms, how you run, but ultimately everything data oriented works in that production domain. And the two need to remain separate, and they need to be considered separately as software development cycles. That's important because your software development cycle, your SDLC for data, is very much oriented around your business consumer of those data products and data pipelines. They're not necessarily interested in anything to do with the application cycle, but they do need a resilient way of bringing new data products to market. We'll talk about that in a second. I mentioned the toolchain piece as well. The distinction here is it's typically much wider than DevOps. It's about looking at how do I integrate and manage a set of tools. And that manage point is key. There's people often don't think about that. What they think about is transactions between quite distinct separate services, and I don't need to worry about one to the other. Actually, DataOps is about improving visibility across all of them and making sure you've got the appropriate monitoring and alerting across different parts of your data services chain that people can consume. So if I'm a DevOps team, if I'm a team building data products, I can look to a DataOps capability and know that it can help me string together an understanding of how my data is flowing through my organization. And test everything is another really important point. So with DataOps, well, with DevOps, what we typically worry about are things like full stack regression testing or unit testing for a particular new piece of functionality. Test everything. Well, actually in data, there's other types of testing we need to do as well. We need to be able to performance test at scale. We need to be able to quality test both relevance and sort of runtime accuracy of data as it moves through. And what this has turned, particularly at firms like Spotify, is DataOps into a capability, data quality into a capability that is as important itself as those capabilities down the data pipeline that are producing insight. Let's look at a couple of examples of this. So in the case of Azure, I'd encourage you to look at the sort of modern Azure architecture. I'm not going to go into this in much detail, but this is their real-time analytics example that they have on the Microsoft website. But this is just a good example of something we did recently with a client around DataOps in Azure. And the key thing we were trying to emphasize on that environment management piece is that there's a couple of different development paradigms that people work with. So dev, UAT, and prod, but actually what we need to do is maintain prod-like data in all environments that is synchronized using Azure native services. Okay, and they have a landing, staging, and analytics sandbox zone to also manage this other component of the development lifecycle, which is effectively how your data is managed and conformed as it moves through different stages of processing. And that's particularly important because it ensures that you have representative data in all of these, and that you have a prod-like representation down here in this dev environment. So this should look quite familiar to some of you, but the key thing is, for those who haven't seen something like this before, it's about that data SDLC. The other piece that I've emphasized there is around the monitoring. So it's about monitoring that sits holistically across all stages of deployment, whether you're working with a Databricks capability or the data factory component, or more downstream, let's say a Synapse component if you're using Azure. And again, that's just as important in the delivery because you want that end-to-end visibility on your DataOps pipeline. So I'm not going to go into this too much detail. There's little bits up here I'll talk to in a second around sort of tenants, but the key point we can refer back to this is that distinction between data and application SDLC. This feels like a lot of effort, you can probably gather I'm saying, but it's worth investing in. And the reason is, and the other distinctions between DataOps and DevOps. So the key thing for me about DataOps is that it's about enabling simplicity. So I talked about pipelines, data pipelines. So the other distinction I use with DataOps is it's about empowerment of responsible self-service. So the important point is your engineering controls on how you manage data deployment to ensure that you have checks in for things like DQ, but primarily you also have checks in for things like PII data as well, and make sure that you've got a realistic expectation of what realistic expectation, apologies, to data consumers of what they can technically or feasibly do with that data at any given time. So what you don't want to be doing is facilitating a data development process where your consumers can't act well. Your consumers are overly empowered and not actually given signposts for what they should be responsible for. So examples of that include sort of security, PII management, as well as that level of performance optimization that we need to ensure that they are completing before they put things into production. I'll come more onto that in a bit. The other key point around DataOps is things like human-in-the-loop intelligence feedback cycles. So a lot of organizations with DevOps, we want a feedback cycle on this piece of functionality. What I've seen with products like Palantir Foundry is a good example, is actually people now start to treat data as an asset. What I have is a construct, a level of automation where I can say, for this data table or data file representation, actually this is a curated object for me, it's of importance, it's supporting my service, I treat it as a product, and therefore I can provide feedback loops on it. So my whole service allows me to tag this product as an entity and say, right, there's a problem with it, it's not reporting what I need, and actually I treat data as a product in real time. A lot of people make the mistake of doing data ops, they're not treating data as a product, they just treat the code and pipeline as a product. And what we're starting to see in sort of modern solutions is that actually that data as a product thing is key because it allows people to report on it, incident manage it, and deal with it as I suppose a configurable item. So data is as code itself. I suppose the other point with DataOps is it allows us to be more responsive to intangibility of data and analytics, and this is really, really important because data analytics inherently, you don't understand the outcome until you've actually started to test the data. So we can build data products, we can build fabulous reports, we can build machine learning models, but until we've actually started to test it actively, we don't know what the return on investment value is going to be. And so we need to accelerate that cycle. And so a lot of what's talked about is about there's something called the value versus the innovation pipeline, which is really important. So, and the example I'll use here is that again, in traditional DevOps, we have one way we're bringing new features to market. So that's fine. In DataOps, we have the same. We're bringing new inferences. We're bringing new constructs to market through this innovation pipeline that we call it. But the other thing you've got to do in DataOps is get your data to market more quickly. So it's about also, it's not just focusing about your ability to deploy new data pipelines and functions, so data pipeline code and functions, it's about accelerating your ability to deploy new data itself, okay, and getting over those integration hurdles and that and the joining together of constructs that allow you to bring data to market more quickly. As I mentioned, it's also things like data quality and performance testing automation, as well as automation of a lot of the standard patterns people use for things like data handling. So that will include the difference between managing deployment of new data, you know, baselining a very large database or representation, and data runtime, you know, updating that on a day-to-day basis. So drawing distinction between those and making sure you've got constructs to manage them. The same applies for any level of analytics model. So any machine learning model, it's the same thing. You have to deploy it initially, and then you have to manage it over runtime. And finally, the key distinction for me, and this is the last I'll sort of talk about DataOps in general, it's the foundation for transformation through continuous intelligence. So we're starting now to see a merging of DataOps as a technique with other techniques such as MLOps, which I'll come on to in a second, because of the fact you can align your data pipeline management and your configuration management of machine learning artifacts. Okay. And as a really good example of this, I'd encourage you to look at the stuff done by ThoughtWorks. So this was taken from a presentation I attended last year, but they have a pretty good thinking, and it's something we've thought about in terms of linking this up with DataWorks on the continuous intelligence piece specifically. And the point I suppose here is that as a capability, they've worked with products like MLflow, but what we're trying to do is link up this management of our training, test, and production data cycles with our management of this model evaluation deployment cycle. And the key thing here is these additional stages of productionize and integrate. You know, so this distinction here to me is just as important in your advanced analytics cycle as management of your data coming in. And a lot of people forget this, and for me that's why this is so important to bear in mind. You know, success of continuous integration, continuous intelligence within sort of operations of analytics totally rides on your ability to manage your data effectively flowing into it. And so that's a really interesting distinction I draw, but the point is that it's that DataOps provides a foundation for continuous intelligence being effective. I suppose to round up on the continuous intelligence piece, it also extends, you know, so we'll start to get paradigms like where you can use machine learning models to manage data sources themselves, things like process control or data science models for profiling, automated feedback loops from MLOps, as I just mentioned. And probably the most interesting thing is examples where you can start to layer data pipelines and subsequent analytical processes more formatively. And a good example of this is more modern concepts around digital twin, which I'm starting to see in my current organization, where they're modeling effectively pumps and interactions between sets of ecosystems of pumps. And the point is, most people focus on small scale machine learning problems, sort of singular models. Actually, where real business value is your ability to orchestrate large scale modeling of various different analytical processes to run with a hypothetical scenario. So, for example, if I want to increase top line revenue in a retail organization, you don't want to just rely on modeling one campaign. You might want to rely on modeling multiple campaigns plus an adjustment in pricing on particular products. And so the ability, I suppose, to manage that effectively moves to DataOps and doing DataOps well in your organization. So if you haven't already, start to invest DataOps as a capability. So what's the bad then? So I've said this, it might be familiar to some of you, not so familiar to others. The problem is it's still hard. It's really hard to do this well, okay? And we're talking about building infrastructure, ground up, leveraging the best of cloud and thinking about how we balance development of the right services to ensure that we can sufficiently meet those data consumer outcomes, whether they be an operational sort of application or whether they be just consumers who just want access to curated and commoditized data sets. And so my one recommendation with doing this, and the focus area, is to just aggressively avoid complexity in terms of the way you mobilize a DataOps capability. I'm going to talk to you what I mean by this. So if I was to summarize complexity, well, these are examples of complexity. Why are you spending a lot of money on data scientists? It's because machine learning models are quite complex. They're hard to manage. Why curation of data analytics assets is still a problem? Well, it's because it's difficult to get right, and we come up against these problems of security and PII that I mentioned earlier. And why adopting principles of software engineering doesn't work? Well, it's not necessarily that the principles don't work. It's the mindset to not orient around that data SDLC. And so if I was to sort of give you an example, this is an environment I've sort of worked in recently, but also clients past, a lot of people approach DataOps in the wrong way. They assume that everyone is this wonderful coder, sort of building an ecosystem of services, the sort of ecosystem of data pipelines, that build up around them, and you've got this wonderful forest of green and consumable data products. And the reality is, as we all know, very, very different. It's not that everyone's a clicker, but very rarely this archetype of developer that we may want within our own DataOps capability. And so realistically, people tend to talk about one of these sort of things, but actually what we end up doing is building a set of data analytics products and services that are empowered through a DataOps capability. Okay, and those products and services are leveraging a range of different things. They're leveraging siloed existing data sources, cloud capabilities, or service lines we might set up in an organization, local people running our code on their desktop, and a bunch of people with ideas. And the key thing for me is about that bunch of people with ideas. They're the same. That hasn't changed over the years. 11, 12 years I've been working in this industry. They ask the same questions, and they will continue to ask the same questions and make the same statements. And those statements include things like I've got on the top of this screen. I care about the constraints. Why can't I just put it into production? I don't want to be bothering with this development lifecycle piece. I like to think in terms of narrative, not code. And that's really important, actually, because when you're working in data analytics, you want to be able to tell a story. You don't want to be able to describe an object-oriented set of functions. And I can't find the data I need. Why can't I just deploy this wonderful model? So these problems aren't going to go away. And therefore, so my reflection was, well, how do we help navigate that consumer space in the best way and make sure our DataOps capability is effective? So the first thing, quite simply, what I put on top of the screen. So key thing for me, the number one thing, is think about your DataOps strategy in terms of two different things. You have a strategy for supporting people in developing insight versus developing data or analytics products. And this is really important, so that people often revert to the latter alone, or they'll revert to the latter and say, and we'll slap on a few Jupyter notebooks on top of it. But that's not the same as what I mean for developing insight. Treat your customers who develop insights, who focus on not necessarily building end-to-end data pipelines, but who want to essentially have services to ensure they can access the data they need, crunch numbers, and provide a business recommendation, just as important as those who build data analytics products, because they're just as important to the business and they drive just as much value. And the point is, they need to operate in a certain way as well, because there's very distinguished needs between their needs between the way they may operate as an analyst versus the way they may operate as a data scientist. And so both would fall into different camps in terms of the way they need to develop insight. And so it's the number one miss that I see. But if people don't align their DataOps strategy with both, what you end up with is an organization that's oriented towards orchestrating and managing products that is terrible at providing capabilities to just work with data. And just give a frame to that, a few examples. So first recommendation is accept and understand common and emergent standards for the analytics that they're doing. So not just the tools, not just the Jupyter notebooks, understand how they're doing the analytics on them. And this is a really important distinction, because products like Jupyter, the reason they're popular isn't because it's tooling per se. A lot of it's just Spark and Python. It's that notebook format, it's the ability to produce content in a consumable fashion. So those trends will continue. There's different challenge approaches of doing it. Products like Dataiku are also looking at a number of different ways of approaching this, but fundamentally, that's what drives the needs of those developing insight. And in some cases, that's what drives the needs of those who want to develop data analytics products. Second thing I would recommend with this, particularly, is also when you think about developing insight, and I'm going to challenge the statement I made earlier, there's no development data in analytics, just data. So with a lot of clients, what I've said is, can we insert the phrase exploration environment into vocabulary? Because people often make the mistake of saying, well, my data development lifecycle is dev, test, and prod. Well, to anyone who just wants to work with data, there's no distinction either. And the mistake we made is we set up and we plan for a development setup within our DataOps lifecycle that doesn't have the data in it. It's required for fit for purpose analysis. And so exploration environment might take on a couple of different shapes. It might be a prod-like environment from all the security and PII perspectives, and obviously with a level of, let's say, identity and access management that's integrated to ensure that your developers can appropriately work with data, but locked down to a certain extent with certain flexibility on capabilities to allow them to explore. So maybe a few more engines they can work with as a privileged user. So that might be an exploration environment in the way it's controlled, but it distinguishes itself from a production pipeline environment, because ultimately when you deploy a pipeline, you want certain constraints in place around resource management and services that are available to be able to run robust data jobs or transactions. So that's the second recommendation. And the third is, think very, very hard about your tenant design. I use the tenant often with an AWS slant, but make sure you understand the carrot and stick. So a lot of clients I've seen, they thought very hard about how they lock down security and ACLs and personas associated with their environments, and then tailored their DataOps capability in such a way to open up quite a degree of flexibility in terms of the different engines that are available to users. So this might include products like Databricks or something like a Redshift ephemeral cluster if you're working with AWS. But the important point here is they thought quite hard around, okay, what's that carrot and stick I want to offer to the insight consumers, and what do I want to develop for those who want to build more formative products? A good example again of that is actually that exploration piece. They've developed pricing models which focus on one price point for people who just want to come in and explore data, a different one for people who want to operationalize it. And that's good because that incentivizes people to contribute data to an ecosystem. What it doesn't do is place the cost on development. For the latter, where your different cost model for developing and operating, that feedback mechanism means if people underinvest in development, their operations take a hit. Vice versa. So it's about producing mature feedback loops to sort of deal with that problem space. So yeah, key thing here is understand the differing needs of developing insights and developing products. And again, I suppose one final example is your analyst versus data scientist. You may want to give your data scientists free rein over services and data and compute, but practically you probably want a DataOps option which packages that up in a more constrained way, configurable, to ensure that they can't outgo a certain bounds of remit in terms of, let's say, how much processing power they can take within a day's worth of consumption, to make sure that your cost point isn't prohibitive. And therefore, again, distinguishing that is really, really key in doing that exercise up front. So that leads quite nicely into my next point, which is keep it simple, stupid, and understand those personas you're running with. And this sort of comes off the back of that previous piece. The problem a lot of clients have is that they go down that road of, even if they distinguish between insight and product, where they have a lot of different personas for how you consume DataOps services. And this is a problem because it gets hugely consuming, because what people think about is they think about the DataOps service they build, but they don't build in those security, data protection and quality assurance responsibilities on the pipeline. And that is just as important for ensuring it's effective at scale. It can't come secondary to this, it has to come up front. So where I've seen this successful is where clients, what they do is they drive a clear agreement on personas to guide different consumers out in the business on how they consume data products, and then they tailor the DataOps developments, those services, to make sure they can fulfill the needs of those personas, but they keep it simple and they drive education and ownership. And that means that your DataOps team isn't managing the risk of what people do or try and develop with data pipelines. What it means is you're empowering your users to be responsible. And a good example of this is one where we might be able to distill down the personas we use in an organization to just 3 basic personas, maybe split by different types of data domain, but a product owner, developer, and an analyst. Okay, and your developer may have responsibility for your quality assurance and appropriate security implementation. Your product owner will have responsibility for data protection, as may actually your analyst, and your analyst may pick up other duties around data management and let's say for example, data cataloging. Okay, but the key thing, they have a remit that they're empowered with, and any functionality that's been provided to them, built by a DataOps org, aligns with them. There's clear alignment between these different aspects. So, key thing for me, keep it simple. Okay, understand your personas, drive them aggressively through, and upfront understand and qualify those security, data protection, and quality assurance responsibilities. And the QA piece, what I mean by that is, what does good data engineering and a robust data pipeline look like? Okay. Third point is what big mistake people often make with DataOps services. So modern delivery now, we empower the business. We want the business to run their own DevOps teams or development teams, agile teams, whatever they are. But fundamentally, we want to empower people to build their own data analytics products and services. So often when we're developing a DataOps capability, we give them a way of managing a data pipeline across different technologies. Off you go and build an asset or a set of assets. But what we forget is that those teams want to operate as DevOps teams. So that point, ops, they need to be able to independently operate data analytics assets as well. And therefore, you need to think about this up front. So the point here is, they may only be interested in these items. So they are out there in the business managing data analytics products, whether that be data sets or reports, and they may just want to increment them and manage the data in them. But they need the capabilities to all do these things as well. Okay, and so these are the guardrails you need to consider in terms of engineering for them. So they need clean capabilities to make sure they can availability manage their pipelines. Not everyone's going to run ephemeral processes. Not everyone is going to run a consistent security and ACLs model. But you have to think about empowering teams to do that. And this includes monitoring. Monitoring is a really key piece for me. Self-serve monitoring, the ability to understand components of the pipeline and be able to access the appropriate alerting data for me able to manage my product and its availability. So that people tend to miss this because they come from centralized sort of build and run it yourselves model when they build out DataOps. And the point is here, think about how you're empowering your consumers to be effective in their service ownership themselves. And finally, of the 4, my recommendation is, when you build out DataOps, build it out in parallel to your consumption and operational integration analytics. Plug it into reports. Don't just build data marts, and do that from the off. And the reason for that is, success for DataOps should not be measured on your ability to deploy a pipeline. It should be based on your ability to manage it, manage change in that pipeline. Okay, and that's really, really important. So until the business sees that data, they're not going to provide a level of iteration, and therefore on the product, and therefore it's really, really important that you're able to measure that. But then I suppose the main thing is then respond to it. Your ability to manage change in the data pipeline is actually your measure of success for DataOps. And if you don't think about, okay, the way data is being consumed, and that quote I use at the bottom, I'd encourage all of you to look at the 9 laws of data mining, because I think it's a really good, it's been around for donkey's years, but it's a really good frame on modern data science and analytics. But unless you build out a DataOps capability in this way, it'll prove very difficult to respond to change in future. I suppose that brings me on to the ugly. Okay, so I've 4 points there, but the ugly is that that's going to become more and more essential. Okay, ROI from data analytics products will be fully dependent on our ability to adapt to change. And what I mean by that is, once something's deployed, it's useful up until the point the data is useful. Okay, so if the data changes, you need to respond to it. You need to make it relevant again. And therefore, ongoing value is entirely dependent on your ability to adapt to change in your organization, to have a DataOps capability that can flexibly ensure that you can maintain that. And a good example of this is my reports. My data goes wrong. I need to fix it. Okay, and this will perpetuate not just actually because the data is wrong, but because there's very human behavior, the false positive paradigm that trust in that data is invalidated. Okay, and I say the false positive paradigm because as time goes on, as we integrate machine learning models, it just gets harder and harder to manage. Okay, so your ability to have a data capability that can make pipeline changes, that can manage change effectively, is really, really key to manage that trust in data and reports and analytics you create off the back of it. And I suppose the point for me is that it's not just going to get worse, the very model of the industry is going to change. So we have a default model at the moment where it's quite static. You train, you test, and you deploy machine learning models. But if you think about it over time, that's going to get faster. We're going to get more of these change cycles as we build model upon model, and it will become more dynamic. And what we'll start to see is a problem space where if we can't respond to that change quickly, it just invalidates our output. It invalidates all your analytics because you can't respond to keeping your data or models up to date. And that's why this is so important. It's because, yes, you need to be able to manage your data pipelines flexibly, but you also need to be able to manage those associated analytics assets effectively, and that they all culminate into the ability to manage change effectively. Okay, and that train, test, deploy cycle, it may change in future. We may find there's a paradigm that comes out of data science that's much more fluid, incremental model change. But the point here is that it's much more dynamic, and that's inevitability. And so key thing for me is about thinking about that ugly and how you ensure with your DataOps capability and your ML ops or whatever extension that they're of it, you are effectively able to manage change across assets. So what next? Well, that's really it for today. I've talked about an awful lot here and quite both high and low level content. But the key thing is, you've got one takeaway: is start to invest in understanding DataOps as a capability. But if you're going to build on it, focus on these 4 items. Differentiate your needs between data insight, data product. Aggressively reduce the personas you deal with in terms of services consumption. Understand and engineer guardrails for self-serve operations. Okay, so don't just think about deploying the data product, think about empowering your users to manage it effectively. And then finally, measure success based on the ability to change. Okay, don't worry so much about that deployment piece. It's about your ability to manage subsequent change that's really key, because that's what's going to become business critical. And that's it for today. Thank you very much for your time.
If you do have any further questions, then Mark and Tom's email addresses are up there on the screen. Feel free to reach out.